Good evening and welcome to the Redwood Library in Athenæum. My name is Benedict Lecca, Executive Director. I am speaking from East Granite, Rhode Island, on the outskirts of the forest at home. It was just too cold and dark, but never mind. We are very pleased this evening to welcome Lichen as he discusses resting in peace in Newport, monuments from the past lessons for the present, and his new book, A Guide to Historic Burying Sites in Newport. When we think about the incredible burial sites that we have all over Newport, it is really remarkable. So this book is certainly welcome, and we're very, very excited about this talk. Lou currently serves as the chair of the Newport Historic Cemetery Advisory Commission. He is also a Newport County representative to the Rhode Island Historical Cemetery Commission. So I want to welcome everyone. I hope you had a good Thanksgiving. And please help me welcome Lichen to our screens.
Thank you, Benedict. And thank you, everyone, for joining me tonight. Let me get started. Oh, pardon me. Okay. And it's not coming up. All right. Excellent. Okay. I apologize. There we go. So welcome and thank you very much for your interest in our burial sites in Newport. There are more than 24 sites with thousands of gravestones scattered throughout the city. And I'm hoping my presentation tonight will shed some light on the sites and the stones, the people who created them, and some of the people for whom they stand for. Many of our sites, more than half, were established before we were a country. We were a colony. So we call it the colonial era. And those sites are referred to as burial grounds, burying grounds, boneyards, graveyards, or churchyard. What they share is an unplanned structure. There's no hardscape, there's no landscaping, there's no master plan. They just kind of evolved. And other than that, they could be similar in the stones that you would find there, but they could also have very unique features. We have a few sites that are what would be called a family site. And this is the predominant form of burial in the colony of Rhode Island, and it actually would be the predominant form of burial in the state of Rhode Island. There are thousands of family burial sites scattered throughout the state. So if you live in East Greenwich, very likely on your family piece of ground, you would be buried along with the rest of your family members, or Chepachet or Cranston. Newport's a little bit different, but we still had that family element. And you can see the starred family burial sites here. Most of these sites are relatively small, usually 50 graves or under. The colonial stones that we'll talk a lot about are slate, and you can see many of them in this picture. This is the Jonathan Easton site, located just off Annandale Road. And it shows another trait of many of these sites in that the stones are colonial. It was set up in colonial times, but maybe 100 years later, usually in the 1850s, a stone wall was put around the site. And I see that also at the Coddington burial site on Farewell Street and the Coggeshall burial site. So while the core of it is colonial, the walls are much more mid-19th century. The Coggeshall site is important because in that site is the oldest dated stone in the colony of Rhode Island, 1647. And Jonathan Coggeshall, who set aside this land to be used as a family site, served as the first president of the colony under the patent of 1644.
Lou, I'm sorry
It's
to
also
interrupt
important
you,
to mention tonight.
but your PowerPoint isn't up. We're not able to
Yes.
see it.
Oh, thank you, Julia. But
Sorry
you can
to
hear
interrupt you.
my audio, huh?
Yes, we can hear you.
No, that's okay. All right. So let's see what I can do. Thank you. All right. Julia, how are we doing
Perfect.
now?
We can see it now. Thank you.
All right. I'm going to go back briefly. So here are those sites I spoke about. Thank you for letting me know that. Here are those sites showing you where the colonial burial sites are located. And then we were looking at these family sites. And this was the picture of the Easton site that I mentioned, the colonial stones with that 1850s wall around it. The Coddington site and the Coggeshall site show the same format, colonial stones, 1850s wall around it. And in that Coggeshall site, here's that John Coggeshall stone, the oldest carved stone we have in the colony in the state. And Abraham Redwood married into the Coggeshall family, and he actually rests in this site. Some of our colonial sites are connected to a religious organization. And it's interesting that two of them, Coddington and Clifton, which started as family sites, then will be connected to the Quakers or the Society of Friends. On the left is a picture of the Clifton site. This is tucked in behind the library on Spring Street. And while it started before 1670 as Thomas Clifton's family burial site, it soon became a place for Quakers to be buried. Toward the back of that picture, there's a brick house. There was a piece of land that was purchased about 100 years later by the Wanton family. And they had a family site closer to the harbor and decided to move their loved ones to the top of this hill, most likely to get away from the harbor and away from the water. What's unique about the Wanton family site that abuts the Clifton site is that rather than bury their loved ones one next to the other, they actually dug an underground vault, and there are 12 bodies or 12 burials in that crypt. One of them, William Wanton, served as a colonial governor of Rhode Island. This small site has other colonial governors as well, including Walter Clark. And Walter Clark was married to a woman named Freeborn, who just happened to be Roger Williams' daughter. Their daughter, Mary, married Samuel Cranston, so she was not only the granddaughter of Roger Williams, but the wife of Governor Samuel Cranston. So quite a bit of history in this one small site. If you take a closer look at the Coddington burial site, once again, it started out as a family, and then it became home to many Quakers to be buried there, and 6 of them happened to be colonial governors. So you'll see the names of Bull and Easton. The stones, some of them did not do well over time, and they're badly deteriorated in this site, but there were also points at which there was a desire to further honor the men buried here. So on your left, you can see an 1839 stone that was erected in honor of William Coddington by the city of Newport. So it's interesting when you get into some of these sites to see the variety, and you might want to question why a more modern looking stone is in with these other slate stones. The Quakers will eventually set their own burial site. If you're in the area of Tilden, Feek, White, and Edward Streets, that was the Friends' burial site. And if you were a devout colonial Quaker, you were instructed to have a very simple stone, if any stone at all. People were not buried in the Quaker faith in family units, but you were buried as you died. So many times families are split up. And the other interesting thing is that the Quakers felt that the names of the month had pagan origins. So you'll notice on Thomas Robinson's stone, he did not die in November, but he died in the 11th month. Now, not all Quakers followed the doctrine as closely as Mr. Robinson. So you will find Quaker stones that are very elaborate and that will have the name of the month. Newport is home to the oldest established Jewish burial ground in the country. The congregation that arrived in 1658 were mostly Spanish and Portuguese Jews who found a safe haven in Newport. The burial site was purchased in 1677 and later enlarged. And like those earlier sites I showed you, the gate and the fencing around this was added in the mid-1800s. And this gate is a wonderful example of Egyptian revival architecture that would have been popular at that time period. The center of the site has these 4 obelisks for members of the Toro family. Isaac Toro was the first religious leader of the congregation, and his oldest son, Abraham, whose obelisk is to the right, is important because he gave money to the city of Newport to pave the street that ran between this burial site and the synagogue. And because of that gift, the city renamed the street Toro Street. His younger brother, Judah, his obelisk to the left, gave the city $10,000 to buy a park, and in that park was a stone mill or a Viking tower, whatever you prefer. So when you visit the Newport Stone Mill or the Stone Tower today, you'll see that it stands in Toro Park because of Judah's kind gift. Perhaps the most important stone in this site is from Moses Satius. In 1790, Moses Satius wrote a letter to President Washington, and Washington wrote back to the Hebrew congregation in Newport. Those letters are important in our history because in them, this concept of religious freedom is clearly stated. And what makes them even more important than just an expression of that is the fact that this is before religious freedom was part of our Constitution. Every August, the Satius and the Washington letters are celebrated in the city, and that is the one day of the year that this site is open to the public. So hopefully you'll get to visit it next August. We have a quintessential Church of England church and churchyard in Trinity Church. And it would have been an important place to be buried, and therefore many members of the congregation are not buried here. To be buried in this site is really reserved for the most important people connected to the congregation, including Nathaniel Kay. And those of you familiar with the city may have heard of K Street. K Street is named after Nathaniel. During his lifetime, he funded the Trinity School. And in that school, you had students like Benjamin Waterhouse and Gilbert Stewart. After he passed, Nathaniel Kay's estate funded the church for many years and kept it going. There's an interesting inscription on the right-hand side of the stone, and the arrow shows you that kind of tilted so you can read it a little better. Many of you are aware that Dean Berkeley was here for many years, and his presence may have led to the founding of the Redwood Library. Well, a few days before Dean Berkeley was to return home with his family, an infant child, Lucia, died. And you can see that Nathaniel Kay provided a space for the child to be buried, and an inscription was placed on his ledger stone here at his grave site. Two other important religious groups in Newport during the colonial times were the Baptists and the Congregationalists. And while there are small grave sites connected to those religious groups, the majority of their congregants are buried in the common burying ground. We also at one point had a very active Moravian church, and their church and burial ground stood behind the current Viking Hotel. As the city grew and that area was getting redeveloped, the bodies and the stones were removed to the common burying ground in 1867. When you look at a map of colonial Newport, and this is a very familiar map from 1777, Blaskowitz notes there were 9 different congregations. And I find it remarkable that there were 4 Baptists and 2 Congregationalists, and then you get the Quaker, the Jewish, and the Moravian. While some of them, the wealthier, perhaps the more important, would have had a table tomb or a box tomb, the majority of burials are marked with a tablet. And those early tablets have the image of a winged death head. Now, it's somewhat reflective of Puritan New England, this feeling of you're going to die, your life is over. It's really focused on the body. But as we become a more enlightened community, and as religious beliefs change a bit, the death head is exchanged for a winged soul effigy, which is a little less harsh of an image, a little more optimistic, and a little more focused on your spirit that we hope is going to a better place. What's remarkable is that every religious organization, including our Jewish congregation, uses the same imagery, the same stone design. And here's a wonderful example of a stone with Hebrew on the top and the English on the bottom. On the side panels, the oldest stones will have fruit and pomegranates and pumpkins. And then as the imagery changes, we get into vines. And what's interesting is the variety of vines and the flowers. The arrows are showing you a very common element, which is considered to be a fig, but the circled element is more of a thistle. And if you look to the picture all the way to the left, it's really an inverted flower head. So quite a lot of variety in these vines as different carvers create their memorials to the dead. Christian burials were generally on an east-west axis with the head towards the west, so that on Judgment Day, you would rise up and face the rising sun. And there would be a headstone and a footstone. When they are lined up this neatly, it's possible that somebody might have done that to make landscaping a bit easier. They may not have been that organized when they were put in the ground 200 years ago. I like to think of as divided in life as these different religious organizations were, in death, they were pretty much the same, including using the same design on their stones and the same carvers. You might remember early on, I showed you the picture on the left. This is the John Coggeshall stone, the oldest one in the colony, 1647. And prior to 1705, if you wanted a gravestone in the city of Newport, you had to bring it in from somewhere. And very likely it would have come from Boston. 1705, all that changes because a man by the name of John Stevens arrives. John Stevens, we know very little about before that time period, but he's already middle-aged. He's in his 50s. He has just started his family, and he has moved here, and he is a mason. So he is involved building fireplaces, building foundations, building steps, and he gets into the stone carving business. And it is believed that the image on the left was the inspiration for his early carvings, which is the picture on the right. I like to think of this as a winged muffin head. So if you walk into any cemetery and you see a winged muffin head, you can be pretty sure that John Stevens was the carver of that. you'll notice that it is etched into the stone. There's no dimension to it. So it's not very well done. But that's okay, because John Stevens will improve. And the picture on the top left of your screen is about 10 years later, and you can see a lot of dimension to this. You can see he's using images now of people's faces. He's not just using that winged muffin head. So he really does improve quite a bit as a carver. Now, if that was all he gave us, that would be something. But his legacy is that 5 more generations of the Stevens family will continue to carve gravestones, not only in Newport, but for all of New England and the East Coast. When he reaches an old age, the business is inherited by his oldest son, who I'll refer to as John II. John II takes over the business, is taking care of his elderly parents, is taking care of his younger brothers and sisters. He, like his father, is also a mason, so he's building foundations and ovens and all those things. He's a patriot, so he's really quite a remarkable person in committing to his family and his community. He and his brothers will really solidify what we'll come to know as the Stevens style of carving. And they are especially known for these front-facing bald effigies, meaning soul effigies. He, of course, will have a son that he will name John Stevens, and I'll refer to as John Stevens III. And John Stevens III will be educated as an artist. So when he takes over the family business after the Revolution, he is not a mason like his father and grandfather. He's more of an artistic person, trained that way, and he does some very artistic carving with his stones. It's not fair to say that he was a poor businessman, because after all, after the Revolution, this city was in shambles, but the business did suffer under his leadership. The first 3 generations of Stevens carvers lived and carved at 30 Thames Street. And if you visit this site today, the backyard has been sold off and built up, but there was a carving shop back there for the first 3 generations to use. Now, the original John Stevens had other sons. Number 2 and number 3 sons, Philip and James, they knew they weren't going to inherit anything from dad, so they went to sea to earn their living, which is very typical of men in Newport in that time period. They did manage to carve stones when they would be in town, some of them very good, some of them not so good. But it was the youngest brother, William, the youngest of the 4 sons of John Stevens, who would stay on land. He became a merchant. And perhaps because he was land bound, he was able to do quite a bit of carving on his own and with his brother John. There are more colonial stones attributed to William Stevens than any other carver in town. So his impact is quite remarkable. He is also connected to 2 other important stone carvers. John Bull was an adolescent, a teenager, when he was trained to carve by William Stevens. So John Bull's early work looks very much like William Stevens, but later John Bull will find his true talent and artistry, and many feel he is the most talented of all the carvers. Now, while he does a lot of very different looking stones, the stone at the top of your screen on the right is really his signature look. It's a very gaunt looking face with a scythe and hourglass, and I love the way he has one wing up and one wing down. The the people who evaluate colonial stones look at this and say, it has a lot of emotion. It's very sorrowful. So for that, they feel this is really quite an artistic feat. He'll do a number of really unusual stones. And the one on the bottom left of your picture, some people feel it represents Moses parting the Red Sea. Others feel it's God in heaven. Either way, in colonial times, you did not get biblical scenes on gravestones. So this is quite a remarkable stone. The other carver connected to William Stevens is a man named Pompey Stevens. And we believe that he is the only African carver who carved stones in the city of Newport. And this stone in particular is important because he carved it for a member of the African community. And we'll be talking more about them a little bit later. He actually signed this stone. It says cut by Pompey Stevens. There's another stone that he initialed. And because his carving is in the style of William Stevens, it's very likely that he had something to do with many of the stones that we currently believe William Stevens produced. Three additional generations of Stevens will carve, many of them in this building at 29 Thames Street. And then in 1927, the building and the business is purchased by John Howard Benson, and they rejuvenated the business and today are the premier stone carvers in the country. We are now into our third generation of Bensons carving in the Stevens shop, which claims to be the oldest operating business in the country. So while people of different faiths live together in the city of Newport, I find that they were also buried together in the city of Newport. And the place where that happens is our common burying ground. If you remember a few minutes ago, we talked about family sites and religious sites. And sure, they were important, but 85% of colonial Newport is buried right here. That's remarkable to have a site that encompasses that large a percentage of your population. Everyone was welcome to be buried here, and the only reason you don't have a Jewish segment here is because Jewish law required them to be elsewhere, which is why they're across from the Hotel Viking. Even though the land was given to John Clark in 1640, we believe the site was established in 1665. And there are at least 8,000 known burials covering more than 10 acres. In 1974, this site was added to the National Register of Historic Places. It has always been owned and maintained by the city of Newport. This is a schematic, a map of the site. A few years ago, the commission wanted to create a self-guided walking tour so that you could wander into the site anytime you wanted and have a tour to see the highlights. So where the red stars are, those are the three entrances, you'll find a plastic box with a paper version of this chart and more information. And we have 17 graves marked with driveway markers, so you can take yourself on a tour. This year, the commission decided to leave the tour in place. So even though it's cold, if you hit a nice day and you want to go check it out, please do. It's very challenging. How do you select 17 people as the highlight of this site? I mean, there's so many people you could select, but we try to create a variety reflective of the people who lived, worked, and contributed to the city of Newport. And as you can see underneath, I mean, everybody was here, rich, poor, religious, not religious, all walks of life. Two of the people that stand out to me who are not included in the self-guided walking tour are Dr. Isaac Center, who was in Newport, trained as a doctor, and in December of 1775, he left the area with Benedict Arnold, the man who would become a trader, but in this case, they went to attack the city of Quebec, because at that point that was a British stronghold. Sorry to tell you this, but we lost that battle. So while the men were being held, Dr. Center would have tended their wounds, and then he was able to come back to the city of Newport and serve the citizen as an important doctor for about 20 years. Another important person buried here is Sofia Little. Her father was a United States Senator, so she grew up pretty well off, but she became a writer, a social reformer, an abolitionist, a temperance fighter, and got very involved with imprisoned people. She actually visited Thomas Dorr when he was being held at our Marlborough Street jail. And she got very involved with helping prisoners adjust to life once they came out of jail, and especially women. So it seems very fitting that years later in the Providence or Cranston area, there would be the Sofia Little Home for Unwed Mothers, very much in line with who she was about or what she was about. Now, if you had to pick a star in this site, most people would probably pick William Ellery, because after all, he signed the Declaration of Independence for the colony of Rhode Island. But equal in importance is the section of the burial site just north of Ellery's grave, later to become known as God's Little Acre. And God's Little Acre is the largest collection of professionally carved stones for people of African heritage in colonial America. In a book written by Glenn Knobloch, he stated that if you took all of the stones through the rest of New England and you put them in one site, God's Little Acre has more. For many people of African heritage, these stones may be the only document of their lives. And the stones provide important information as to perhaps family connections, and in some cases, even where people came from. So it's an important historic resource for anyone studying the colonial period, as well as being a wonderful reflection of what was going on in society to give us a much fuller picture. One of the last notable burials in this site was for Dr. Rice. And Harriet Rice grew up on Spring Street. You can see a picture of the house. It's currently a parking lot. She attended Rogers High School, where she was an excellent student, and she was the first African-American graduate of Wellesley College. During World War I, she went to France and served on the front lines using her medical experience to treat the wounded soldiers. And for that, she received a Medal of Honor from the French government. So quite a remarkable woman, buried in among many other remarkable people in God's Little Acre. Now, we were talking mostly about colonial burials, but I have to tell you, about 1800s, burial practices throughout the world really started to change. And it started in Paris, France, in Père Lachaise in 1804, where they said, you know what, having a rotting graveyard, boneyard, whatever you want to call it, in the heart of our city is not a good thing. So what we get is the beginning of the rural or garden cemetery movement. So here's that word for the first time. In the United States, it starts in the 1830s, first in Boston and later in all major cities. And I've included a picture of one of my favorites, Laurel Hill in Philadelphia. These sites were often on the edge of the city. They were very planned, landscaped, hardscape, very picturesque. They started rural with a lot of plantings, but they soon found that the plantings overtook the stones and they needed to make more money. So the plantings went from trees and shrubs into more of a garden lawn-like look, as you see on the right-hand side. Newport has a number of cemeteries. And it's interesting that our first two, number 6, St. Mary's, and number 19, St. Joseph's, were connected to the Catholic Church. St. Joseph's was the first Catholic church in the state of Rhode Island, and their original building was on Barney Street, as well as their burial site, which is lovingly maintained by the Museum of Newport Irish History. 20 years later, the congregation would split. Half would remain St. Joseph's, and the other half would be St. Mary's, and St. Mary Cemetery would be established on Warner Street, just a little further east of Island Cemetery. The stones on this site are wonderful records of not only the people that were here, but where they came from. So if you were an Irish American and you wanted to know, where did we come from in Ireland, these stones would help find those links. And in reverse, if there are people in Ireland looking for loved ones here, it would help them know if their loved ones had landed in Newport during this time period. There are other cemeteries that were established: the Island Cemetery, Old City Cemetery, the Bremen Cemetery, and you can see they really surround the common burying ground. So this is the heart of our burial sites in the city. The Bremen Cemetery and the Old City Cemetery really look, as you're coming into the city, as one site, even though they developed separately. And this provides an important gateway to our city. So many people visiting Newport, coming over that bridge, the first thing they're going to see will be the cemeteries and the common burying ground. The Bremen Cemetery was established on farmland in 1898, and it was well planned out. It was a private cemetery until 1980, when they forfeited the site to the city of Newport. So it is now owned and maintained by the city. Probably the most notable features you drive by are the three sizable Jewish sections. And this was not the Spanish and Portuguese original congregation here, but when the synagogue reopened in the 1880s, it was reopened by East European Jews, and that's the congregation that is buried here in segregated sites. So that's why the fencing is up. The Newport African American community is buried here as well, but not in a separate section, but really distributed throughout the site. And if you walk the site, you will feel like you're in an international village, because the gravestones tell you that the people originated in England or Scotland, France, Sweden, Greece. So it really is a remarkable reflection of the people who were living, working, and contributing to 20th century Newport. There is a good-sized section that was purchased by the Navy Hospital as a final resting place for those who served our country. And we even have a Congressional Medal of Honor winner there, Axel Sundquist, who cleared mines from Guantanamo Bay so that the troops could land during the Spanish-American War. The Island Cemetery actually started out, it was called the New Burial Ground because the word cemetery was so unused at that point. And it was city-owned. It was only 2 acres, and it butt right up against the common burying ground. But 11 years later, the city decided they really didn't want to be in that business, so they sold any remaining property to the owners, who then incorporated, and the Island Cemetery was born. It took almost 40 years for them to acquire all of the acreage that it has today, which is about 26 acres. And you can see along the way that they incorporated the Willow Cemetery, which was established in about 1850. It's interesting that the application for the common burying ground to be listed on the National Register is the same application for the Island Cemetery. And I think because of that, if you look online at a lot of resources, there's a bit of confusion. And there are some places that will say this person's in Island when they're actually in common burying ground, and also the other way around. This was the final resting place of the new middle class that was developing in Newport, but also our wealthiest and most important people. One of the most noticeable structures of the site is the Belmont Chapel, which was put up in 1886 by August Belmont in memory of his daughter Pauline, who died at a young age. And he had George Champlin Mason and Son as the original architects. And then 5 years later, his son had Richard Morris Hunt redesign it. I'm very pleased to share that the Belmont Chapel Foundation is in the middle of a major fundraising campaign to restore the chapel, and major stride has been made in bringing this chapel back to a useful state. So if you're interested in that, there's information on the web. As you look at this picture, you can see that the chapel is at the back of what we call Belmont Circle. August Belmont is buried to the right on this incredible Greek revival exedra. And in the middle is the false sarcophagus of Matthew Calbraith Perry, the man who opened up trade with Japan in 1854. So really quite a remarkable family site here in the Island Cemetery. But the cemetery is filled with artwork, sculpture, statues in metal, in marble, in granite. So it really is quite a lovely place to enjoy. Our burial sites are really outdoor art museums. You could consider the early work to be folk art, but certainly the later work is as good a sculpture as you're going to find in our country. These sites also provide open space in many of our neighborhoods, a place to take a walk, take the dog, or stroller with the kids. And during the pandemic, I have to tell you that I saw these sites really being enjoyed by a lot of people who might not have ever stepped foot in them before. For some of us, the real importance of these sites is their history, because the information that they share is information that has either been lost over time or can be used to implement, to enhance the information that we already have. So really very valuable. Sometimes they contain very public memorials, as in the Navy Hospital site. And there are other memorials as you look around the city, like the one to Ida Lewis that her friends paid for. So very public sites in many ways, but also very private and very personal for the people who have connections to the people buried there. I have to say, in the 20th century, we were not always good stewards of these sites. And we've lost many stones. These sites were in horrible conditions for many years, but there were always people who were dedicated to the sites, dedicated to the stones, dedicated to the stories of the people buried here. And luckily, in the 1970s and the 1990s, they were joined by other people that had the title of preservationists or historians, and more recently, volunteers. There's a renewed enthusiasm to restore these sites to a condition that we all feel proud of. It takes money, and we were so fortunate not too many years ago to get $50,000 to do some stonework in Godzilla Acre, and that was a huge impact for us. That really did help, but I have to tell you, it was a drop in the bucket. Once these stones are gone, once they break, as you can see on this wonderful stone from Minton Prentice, once the stones are lost, they're gone forever. You really cannot recreate them. And our historic burial sites become nothing more than open fields. Well, in my journey through these sites and studying these stones, I've learned quite a bit. So I'm going to share with you some of my aha moments. And it's probably a little more dramatic if you could see me lifting my hands in the air, but use your imagination. When I think about Newport, one of the things that we always talk about is that this was a place of religious toleration. Roger Williams, Ann Hutchinson, they all came because they weren't liked in Massachusetts Bay Colony. So they came here where people of different faiths could come together. And it was a remarkable place. It was a wonderful place. But think about the Baptists. We had 4 colonial congregations. They couldn't get along with each other, so they formed new congregations. And they disagreed with what the Congregationalists thought and what the Quakers thought. So in life, religious beliefs were very contentious, I'll say, but how remarkable that in death, they would all use the same stones, the same images, the same carvers, and in large part, the same site. So it makes me think, if colonial people with very strong religious beliefs could agree on how to be buried, where to be buried, you know what? They had more in common than they realized. And I'd like to think that in today's world, even though the media kind of beats us over the head with how much we disagree with each other, maybe we have more in common with each other than we really think we do. When I look at the Bremen Cemetery, and I got to know these people represent 20th century America. They came to this country and they were proud of where they came from. So on their gravestones, they'll tell you they came from England or Greece or Russia, but they embraced their American citizenship. They were proud to serve this community, proud to serve this country. They believed in family, and they believed in community, and they believed in education. And this is the America that I grew up in, and perhaps you did as well. And the events of the last couple years really started to question immigration and, who we were as Americans. And this site, for me, reinforced what America is, the great melting pot. And I think it's a wonderful reflection of 20th century America. The sites and the stones, I think, are an incredibly valuable resource for studying history of the people, but also the place. So if you really are a student of Newport history, you need to get out into the burial grounds. The history that is written about a very small segment of the population. There's not a lot written about colonial women. There's not a lot written about colonial people from places other than England. And these gravestones really help to document what I refer to as underdocumented people. They also give us a great insight into the society that existed there. Just the fact that you would have a segregated section for people of African heritage tells you about the greater society. And then you have to ask yourself, but the fact that they had stones carved for them, what does that tell us? So while it answers some questions, it raises many more. As I continue to share history with people, I realize that it's a reflection of me. So history really reflects the people telling you the story, as well as the people who it is about. And it's important today that we ask ourselves, who do we trust to report history? We as Americans trust the report of the revolution that the Patriots wrote. We believe what George Washington said. We might not agree with what the Loyalists would have said about the revolution. And it's something as we think about things like CNN and Fox News, who do you trust to tell you history? And how do we kind of make up our minds what we believe to be true? I have a couple predictions for the future. And I don't have a crystal ball, but if I had to go out on a limb, I would say that as we move forward as a society, that burials are going to become simpler and hopefully less expensive. Yes, there will be people building huge monuments to themselves, spending thousands, if not maybe $1 million. But I think the average person is going to want something simpler and less expensive. I feel badly for genealogists in the future because in our time, the use of one last name for a family was fairly common. And as we've moved into the hyphenated last name and we're moving into new areas of family connections, it's going to be more challenging to connect burials to each other. There's a movement in burials for technology. It's been around for years. And you can actually go with your cell phone up to a stone that has a QR code that will take you to a link, which is a video of the dead person talking to you as if they're still alive today. I think that's a little odd, but you know what? If that's what you want to have done when you're gone, go for it. I think you're going to see some of that in the future, but I don't think it's going to be widespread. I really believe that burial sites will continue to be important for communities. I'm not talking about new burial sites. I'm talking about the existing ones. And if you remember that picture I showed you a few minutes ago of the common burying ground in the 1970s, I don't think that situation is going to happen again, especially in Newport. But in general, that demolition by neglect, I think we're a little more attuned to the importance of these sites, and we're not going to allow that to happen. If I had to predict the biggest threat to the sites and the stones, it's got to be money. Because while there may be grant money out there and there might be people who are willing to put forth some energy, it's going to take a lot of money to preserve these pieces of artwork that are in the blazing sun and heat of summer and the freezing cold of the winter. So I really believe that's our biggest challenge moving forward. The state of Rhode Island has a wonderful database that documents not just Newport, but the entire state. It's free, and there it is at the bottom of your screen. You can certainly check them out. If you can't remember that, just Google Rhode Island Historic Cemeteries, and you'll probably find the site. It's searchable by name, by location, a lot of good information there. If you're interested in God's Little Acre, there is a site called colonialcemetery.com that's maintained that's just wonderful. And I referenced earlier a book by Glenn Noblack that's pictured on the right. It talks about all of New England, but there's a lot on Newport in it. I'll call it the Bible for really understanding the stone carvers is called Mallet and Chisel. It was written by Vincent Ludi a number of years ago. It's currently out of print. There are a few copies in our library system, so you can borrow it from the library, or you can buy a copy from Amazon for $330 to $400. I'm working with Vincent, and our goal is to have it reprinted in 2022 for under $50. So stay tuned. I'm hoping that will happen, but we'll see. And finally, I do have my very own website called ripnewport.com that has all the information I presented today, links to everything. Feel free to check it out. And because I'm not going to be around forever and the website won't be around forever, it's now mostly in a book called A Guide to Historic Burial Grounds in Newport, which is available locally at Charter Books, the Preservation Society shops, the Historical Society shop, as well as other places. So I thank you so much for your interest today, and I thank the Redwood Library for inviting me. I'm going to stop the share, and we'll spend some time doing questions.
Lou, thank you so much. That was so informative, absolutely fascinating. I'm going to field questions. I'm not seeing any. You mentioned the Stevens shop. There are stones all over the eastern seaboard. How far have they been repertoried? I mean, are there some in Charleston and most of the colonial cities?
Yes, exactly. So they were carved here, put on ships, and sent south.
Fascinating.
No questions.
Any other questions, people? Right? Do I see one? Well, that's a good sign. Oh, here we go. Is there any way to get into the Coggeshall burial ground? I would hope to take photos.
Yes, there is. The key is actually in the hands of the Preservation Society. So if you would like to go into the site, if you contact them on Bellevue Avenue, they'll be very happy to arrange to meet you there. I have to say, though, that right now would not be a good time to visit it because in September we had a car crash. A car came down Victoria Avenue, crashed into the wall. So it's very unstable at the moment. And I would think I haven't spoken to anybody, but would be unwise to allow you in the site. Hopefully, once the wall is fixed, we'll have it open again for next summer.
Tim Phelps is asking, can you tell us about the Quaker Cemetery in Portsmouth?
Not really, but wherever there is a Quaker community, there could be a Quaker burial site. That should be on the state database, and that would give you the most information.
Are there any other burial sites of signers of the Constitution in our area?
Yes, there are. I believe in the common burying ground we have Mr. Marchant, who was a signer of the Constitution, but I'm not sure if he was. I think that was one of his claims to fame, Henry Marchant.
Evelyn Barak asks, what can be used to clean lichen from a granite stone?
The approved material is called D as in the letter, and then 2, the number. It is a biological growth inhibitor. It is safe for the stone. It is safe for you. The granite some of the granite really grabs the lichen. You can use a scraper, but it needs to be a plastic scraper. So please, no metal. And the goal when you're cleaning a stone is to do no harm. So no bleach, no power tools, nothing wire.
Okay. Janice Bernstein asks, are stone carving classes available at 29 Temp Street?
It's a wonderful question. The answer is no. The Bensons are really the premier carvers in the country, and they spend their time doing their craft, not teaching classes. You could try RISD. They might have a stone carving class, but I don't know of any.
Someone wants to know about Arnold Burial Ground and Alice Brayton saving it. Any info on that?
Absolutely. When you walk up Pelham Street and you look before the Arnold Burial Ground, there's a fabulous Greek Revival house with Egyptian Revival columns. That was built by Augustus Littlefield, and he owned also the Arnold burial site. Well, he wanted to put a cottage up there, and he removed all of the stones and all the bodies, and he sent them to the Willow Cemetery. And there was such a public outcry that he brought it all back and dumped it in a hole. Years later, a cottage was built there, and in 1946, Alice Brayton purchased the cottage, ripped it down, and had John Howard Benson and workers from T.J. Brown's firm basically reset that whole site. When she was all done, she wrote a book about it. And you can actually get the book from Amazon. It's a wonderful 1960s book on the Arnold Burying Ground, $20 maybe from Amazon, that tells you the whole story. She then gave the site to John Howard Benson, and he willed it to the Preservation Society. So they currently own and maintain it. Thanks for asking.
Great. Well, Lou, thank you again. I want to thank everyone that has taken part. I hope you will join us for next week for the first ever live stream piano concert from the Redwood with Audrey Vardanega and Clemens Teufel as they perform a joyful collection of piano music for 4 hands by Debussy, Schubert, and Mozart. It's an inaugural event for us because we have purchased the equipment and we're very excited. It will give you the feeling that you're actually in the Harrison Room listening to the concert, but you'll be in the comfort of your home. If you're not a member, come on over. And if you're not a subscriber, now's the time to make the leap and help us out. In any case, I want to thank everyone and especially our speaker, Lou Keene. And hopefully I will see you all very soon at the Redwood Library. Thank you so much and have a great evening.